Okay.
All right, everyone. Hello. Welcome to June's edition of Meet Our Contributors. We have awesome contributors on the line today to help you out with all of your upstream mentoring needs. Why mentoring? Mentoring at scale is hard, and these folks are here today to give you an hour of their life so that you can get either unjammed, unblocked, more educated, more curious on upstream Kubernetes development. So first things first, we usually do a round of bios, intros, and then we go right into the show with some house rules and some questions. So if you're out there listening right now on YouTube and you want to participate, ask a question, ask Valerie, David, Josh, George, or myself a question, do so in the Meet Our Contributors Slack channel. If you don't have a Slack invite on the Kubernetes instance, it's slack.k8s.io. You can meet us there and meet our contributors. You can also tweet me or send me a DM on the Kubernetes Slack channel if you would rather a anonymous conversation. That's totally fine. Some people say, hey, what's a SIG? And I'm really embarrassed to even ask that. And that's totally okay here. That's what this whole hour is for. It's your hour, your questions. So let's get right into house rules really quick before we do bios. House rules. Make sure that you are kind to each other. We do abide by the CNCF's code of conduct. We also have a code of conduct committee here at Kubernetes. And just please be excellent to each other. This includes the panelists, because you are allowed to ask each other questions. Please, you don't know each other, so feel free to ask each other questions. And that also goes for people asking questions and participating in our chat, in our various resources. So that's the first major house rule. And let's go ahead to bios. So Valerie, why don't you go first? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Valerie. I work at Lyft on Lyft's internal compute platform, so mostly downstream implementation. And then I personally work a lot on Kubernetes SIG network and a couple like scattered areas of Kubernetes contribution.
And you're up with me super early in the morning to do this on the West Coast.
yes, it's 7:30 here.
7:30.
It's not super early, but
no. Who was it? I think I was talking to somebody yesterday. It was like, I think you should like rename this show to like Good Morning Kubernetes. Like
that would be good.
I know, down. So if anybody out there wants to do like a morning program of Good Morning Kubernetes, we're very down. So Dave, thank you so much for joining, Valerie. David, what's up with you?
Hey, this is my first time on the show. I work at Google, and I've been here for 2.5 years. I came fresh out of college from MIT, and the reason why I got into Kubernetes is because while I was at MIT, I took a distributed systems class and ended up implementing Raft as part of the class, so which is the algorithm that backs etcd. And so when I was interviewing for spots at Google, that came up and ended up being one of the reasons why I decided I wanted to try my hand at this Kubernetes thing. And so when I joined Dawn and Yuju and Lantao on the GKE Node team. And since then, I've worked on a lot of monitoring stuff. I've taken up ownership of cAdvisor. So if you open PRs or issues there, you'll most likely see me. And I've also done a lot of work for resource management in SIG-Node. So my starter project when I joined was I implemented inode eviction so that when you use up all of your inodes on your node, something gets evicted instead of everything just crashing. So yeah, that's me.
When those Google interviewers saw your SCD experience, they were probably like, wait, we have something for you. There's this Kubernetes thing.
Yeah.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks for joining today, David. I know it's super early. Josh, what's up with you?
Hey there, I'm Josh Burkus. I work for Red Hat, and I spend a lot of time in SIG release, particularly on the release team. I've been on the release team for, I don't know, 4 different Kubernetes releases, something like that, which is something that people who are listening to this call can do too, because every release we recruit new shadows to learn the various roles on the release team. And I do a number of other things around the project, such as writing last week in Kubernetes development, which I'm actually going to be pushing out this morning.
Tell us a little bit more about last week in Kubernetes development. Who helps you with that?
That's me and Noah Kantrowitz, which is, and it's just a roundup of all of the what we regard as the interesting merges into core Kubernetes for the last week, and developer news, and other sort of related stuff. I started it as an internal newsletter at Red Hat to help our developers keep track of what was going on in Kubernetes. And once it got sufficiently long, I was like, I should really publish this. And so I did. And then Noah joined to help add more stuff to it.
Awesome. So yeah, if you're listening to this and you think, hey, there's no way I can keep up with Kubernetes development. Well, one, welcome to the club. Two, yeah, we're in this. Two, please use Josh Perkis's and Noah's handy field guide for upstream development on last week in Kubernetes development. It is a great resource if you're looking for something to skim. And that brings us to the end of our panelist bios. Again, my name is Paris. I work at Google. I do upstream Kubernetes community support. George is also on the line doing our ones and twos YouTube stuff to make sure that you can hear my loud, annoying voice clearly at 7:30 in the morning Pacific time. Anyway, all right, that brings us to our announcements. Announcements. First announcement is this show is doing awesome. We're receiving thousands of viewers totally for our episodes. We're looking for more upstream Kubernetes developers to help us come on the show. You don't have to necessarily develop, if you will. Yeah, docs writers are included in there, community managers and the like. Please join us. Also, announcements, if you're new to the Kubernetes community and you're just joining us today, we have this lovely thing on Thursdays, every Thursday, except for major holidays and KubeCons at 10 a.m. called the Kubernetes Community Meeting. Why is this important? This is important because, like Josh's last week in Kubernetes development, it's super hard to keep up with things, and we try to have a condensed contributor circus at 10 a.m. every week. This will give you SIG updates, demos for what's the latest in the community, release updates, which are super critical, like when's code freeze. That's super important. And also announcements and shout outs to awesome people in the community. You should totally join us. Again, happens every Thursday at 10 a.m. All right, on to the good stuff. So typically we take questions, random, willy-nilly, whatever comes in. This time I actually curated them a little bit. So I'm going to do some of the new contributor questions first, and then try to move on to the current contributors. But depending on the flow of questions and things like that, we might jump around. But we're going to try this to see if this makes a little bit more sense from a flow perspective. So, question that we always get is, how did you get to Kubernetes again? I know David hit a little bit on it with MIT, but Valerie and Josh, why Kubernetes? Like, you could obviously do other open source. There's probably plenty of other open source players in your stack right now at work. Why this?
For me personally, I got very interested in distributed systems when I was in university. I had a graph theory professor who proposed a couple open problems to the class, and I started trying to brute force them. And I very quickly found that I needed to split the problem up between computers to even have a hope at that. And this being like 2013, 2014, a lot of distributed systems tech like Spark and so on was still very immature. So I started trying to build my own system. So after that, like a couple of years later, when things like Kubernetes emerged in the ecosystem, I was really kind of excited and interested to actually use those in a production-ready fashion.
So you did with distributed systems, David with the distributed systems class. Josh, what's your deal? Why Kubernetes?
So the thing is, I was PostgreSQL, the database developer for many years, and I started working on how to automate high availability for Postgres, because I was a consultant doing a lot of that for clients. And I actually worked on 2 different automated high availability systems that we developed over the years from scratch code. Both of them had a lot of issues. When I started working on number 3 is when Kubernetes first got announced. DockerCon 1, where I was, and I realized that Kubernetes would actually supply a lot of the plumbing that we need, a lot of the distributed systems plumbing that we needed to make high availability work. So I started working with Kubernetes, but of course, a lot of things were missing from Kubernetes at the time that we actually needed in order to make things work. And I don't know, a year or so working with Kubernetes, Red Hat offered me a job working full-time on Kubernetes and related technologies, and I decided to stop being a consultant. So
lots of distributed systems, lots of high availability systems, which is odd. I mean, I know it's not odd, it makes sense, but to have all of you on the call, usually we have plenty of other folks that came in through other weird ways and things like that. So that's really cool. So we always get the infamous question of, what SIG do I join? Where do I start? What's a SIG? Questions or how you would respond to that? I mean, I'm sure all of you on the phone or call rather, apologize, that's my old school. No one's on the phone actually. I'm sure all of you have heard that question in some general sense, probably even at KubeCon this year in Barcelona, when people say, oh, well, what SIG do I join? Where do I start? What's your response?
So Kubernetes development is a very, very huge responsibility. So we have everything broken up into groups called SIGs for special interest group. The SIGs specifically own, they have a specific mission statement of what they're supposed to do. It typically translates to like owning an abstract area and owning specific components in the code base. For example, in SIG network, we're responsible for like the network connectivity in the stack. And that means we own things like the ingress controller, the service controller, kube proxy, CNI spec. If you're looking to choose a SIG, first thing to look at is just like what interests you. For example, like, are you interested in like user experience of workloads? Perhaps SIG apps, which defines things like deployments and stateful sets, would be a good fit. Perhaps you're really passionate about like operations and usability, then maybe like SIG node, which manages the internals of a worker, or sorry, I'm blanking. Cluster lifecycle, which manages like the upgrade deprecation management cycle, would be a good fit. Also, it's fairly easy to just like hop in a Slack channel, look at people's YouTube recordings if you aren't really sure about what's going on and want to kind of poke your head in multiple things. Though I get involved in too many things, and I would caveat that definitely like one SIG is a pretty good workload.
It may or may not be a commonality amongst our contributors to get involved in too many things. But Josh, what about you?
the other thing that I'll say is, in addition to all of those areas, which are going to depend sometimes on what you're already working on, there's also a lot that goes into running all the things for the project. And often the SIGs that are responsible for the project have more demands for people even than the SIGs that work on the code directly, such as, for example, test infrastructure. If you are QA, QE, automated testing geek, DevOps geek, do look at participating in test infrastructure because they've got a to-do list a mile long in terms of doing automated testing and automation of Kubernetes. And it's also really interesting because we've done a lot of things to automate Kubernetes project around GitHub that was just new, that goes beyond what other projects have done. And so if you really are interested in that, not only do we need your help, but it's an opportunity to basically do new stuff.
David, do you get this question?
Yeah, sure. I would say one possible place to start would be to look at the KEPs that are open. A KEP is a Kubernetes enhancement proposal. And I think that can be a more concrete way of looking at, oh, this is what's being done, and these are the SIGs that are involved. And oftentimes that maybe can be a little bit easier to figure out, oh, am I interested in this? Am I not? You know, do I want to go do research about what all these technologies are that they're talking about this being used for? And it's an easy way to get in. And oftentimes they need help just reviewing PRs for the KEP or providing proof of concept work for different KEPs or other things. So I think getting in on the action and finding something that you're interested in is a very good way to start.
Where can people find KEPs?
KEPs, I think they're in Kubernetes/enhancements in the directory KEPs.
I added a link in Slack.
Great, thank you.
Awesome, thanks, George. Yeah, and David, thank you so much for spelling out the jargon too. We have a lot of it, and we have a lot of lingos, and
We do.
we do. Yeah, I don't need to tell you. You're like, we do. Yeah, I feel like providing context is one of the things current Kubernetes contributors can help out with the most as it relates to new contributors, probably. I know 22 months ago I was one as well, and the lingo that was flying around was definitely like, wow, this might be another language. So yeah, I appreciate that, David. All right, so new contributor, of course, wants to know that like, how do you stay up to date? We already talked about this a little bit with Josh's last week in Kubernetes development. They feel just very overwhelmed stepping into the community, joining the Slack channels. Lots going on. Any advice for people who are A, feeling overwhelmed, and then B, any either communication platforms or anything that you think that they should target that would be more wise for their development efforts?
I can speak to this one a little bit. Every once in a while, I'll walk past Tim Hawkins' desk and he'll say something to me to the effect of, I can't keep up with this anymore. I can't see everything that's going on at once, even though I try. And so if you feel like that, know that even the people who know the most, so to speak, in the project can't keep up with it. So my recommendation is generally to try and pick a reasonable scope that you can get the depth that you want at. So for me, what that means is that I pay attention to the kubelet and its APIs for monitoring and resource management, and I only pay attention to certain areas. So I stay up to date in a specific number of things that I think I can pay attention to. Because my scope is pretty small, I tend to know exactly what's going on in a bunch of different areas, and I'm very up to date in those. But if you're someone who, for example, wants to know what's going on in the broader Kubernetes community, then interacting with SIG PM or SIG release and looking at the stuff that comes out of those channels, I think is usually a broader way to get information about Kubernetes generally and all of the things that are happening there.
Oh, one other thing I have to add here about getting started. If you can make it to one of the KubeCons, we, as in SIG Contributor Experience, runs a new contributor workshop at each KubeCon on the Contributor Summit, which will be the day before the main KubeCon, or 2 days before the main KubeCon. And so if you're actually in a position to go to one of those conferences, you can do that as a crash course in the community and how to submit changes and how to do PRs, and all of the other sort of basics that you need to know to contribute.
Both awesome suggestions. I always give the response of, don't worry, no one knows everything. I think that's my latest line that's in the repeat. Like, don't worry, no one knows everything. Valerie, what's some other advice that you have for that?
I'd like to tack on that I actually got started in doing upstream development with the Contributor Summit in Seattle. It was a really useful way to get onboarded. Because I try to do too many things at once, I find it really helpful to watch the list of caps. That's a pretty good way to see like what is user facing that's happening or like requires a lot of coordination. SIG architecture sometimes is a good overview of the project. And beyond that, when I don't have time to like do too many things, I'll at least look at people's meeting agendas and quickly scrub through their meeting recordings so I can maybe spend 5-10 minutes instead of a full hour-long meeting to figure out what's going on in an area. I've also started like writing up digests for SIG network meetings. I'll see if I commit to that or not, just to help with people who maybe don't have all that time to burn.
Yes, time is of the essence, and especially in Kubernetes. So we heard release, we heard new contributor workshop, we heard a lot of different onboarding avenues, if you will. What are some avenues that you see people trying that you don't necessarily think is the most successful approach?
I mean, I would say the classic example of an unsuccessful approach is someone who comes in and immediately wants to make a large change to Kubernetes. So someone who comes in and says, I think Kubernetes needs this and we're going to do it. I think it can be hard, especially to navigate the enhancement process and to navigate the SIGs and to know exactly how to reach out to them and how to effectively advocate for the change that you're trying to make. And the other thing is that oftentimes, you know, I think of something and I think, oh, we need to do this now, but it turns out that actually other people have thought of this before, and it's just not the right time yet. So sometimes it's on the SIG's radar, but they think, okay, that's step 3 in a 1, 2, 3 step process. So oftentimes, for example, in SIG Node 2 years ago, we set out and we said we want to tackle GPUs and other devices, and we want to make topology work, because making sure CPUs and GPUs are matched up on in the same relative place on your board is important. And so, but we ended up having to take a step back and say, okay, we have to leave topology for later because we need to get basic device lifecycle working first. And so a lot of people had to wait for the enhancement that they wanted, but it's finally going in now after we've solved all of the prerequisite things.
That was an awesome example. Thank you for that, David. Anybody else have anything to add to that, or plus one?
I would definitely plus one that. I might also add that this experience will really vary depending on like when you get involved with the project and what you're trying to work on, but the project has a lot of volunteers and people who are stretched too thin, and just like our size and structure means that it can be hard to mentor new people and teach new people about the project. Like there's lots of resources like this, like Contributor Summit that we have. But if you kind of walk into the project and say like, I want to be taught, I want to be like guided through everything, people may not have the time and ability to do that. So you will have to do a certain amount of like digging for work and going through the code and teaching yourself we can provide the resources to make that feasible, but we can't effectively like give everyone a dedicated teacher.
Yes, I completely agree. That's why I think that our best opportunities for people who really want mentoring and really want that experience is through like the release team, and like where there's already teams set up in SIGs, meaning like teams might, like they might have triage teams, stuff like that, where there's already like a shadow role and that's already been built in. And that's a great mentoring deal. I'm sure Josh can talk about that too. But if that's something that you're looking for, if you say, hey, I need a mentor, go to a SIG, ask them if they have any teams that you can join, teams being like with shadow roles. That is the like one of the best pieces of advice that I think we can give you, because like David alluded to, it's super hard to get a feature through when no one knows you. So especially when 31,000 contributors touch our repos in some way, cause some event. So that's a lot of people that are in and around folks who are maintaining the code bases and the doc bases and things like that. So Josh, did you have anything to add to that, or +1 next question?
+1 next question.
All
We're
right.
answering stuff in the channel.
Okay, cool. Thank you. All right. And then, so next question, I think it was a network one, if I recall correctly. Yes. Question for SIG Network. Any starting point for getting into validation or performance testing for Kubernetes networking? Would it be useful for community if all test cases already done and dusted?
If all test cases are what, sorry?
Yeah, no, I think I'll get there. I'll get them to clarify that last statement. But the first statement, any starting points for getting into validation or performance testing for networking?
I suspect that, I mean, I'm kind of passing the buck with this, but I think that SIG testing would be a good place to talk to, as far as like some of the frameworks involved in that. Like we know the mechanics, but the SIG doesn't, SIG networking doesn't deal as much with like how Kubernetes test infra works.
Yeah, and if you're looking specifically at performance, SIG scalability, who handle all of our performance tests.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good suggestion.
Talk a little bit about scalability and their need for contributors a little bit, Josh. I know you're sort of close to that.
Oh yeah, we always do that because we don't have nearly SIG scalability in terms of people who are actually working on the scalability test is only a handful of people, which means there's a lot of performance testing that we're not doing. And it would be nice to do more, which requires more people. So if you are a performance geek, I would, urge you to start there. I'm pretty sure none of our scalability tests currently involve swapping out CNI networks, for example, because that's just something that's been buried on a to-do list. And so if that's your interest, please, step up and actually take a look at that. I know off of our main test framework that I and a couple of other people are actually going to be doing some of that testing, specifically in the context of databases, but I don't have time to make that part of our automated test framework. I don't think it's too complicated to be suitable for our automated test framework. So if you're a network performance geek, please jump on that, because particularly somebody who could not only look at performance for that, but then maybe actually look at some of the causes of lack of performance, if that's what you find, would be awesome.
Yes, I also think, I don't know if I'm going to word this correctly, but we're just going to try it anyway. But I think scalability is one of those special interest groups where it's super hard to break through or break in because it is complex. They do look after the entire system. So I guess my TLDR there is don't necessarily get discouraged if you are one of those self-identified performance geeks that Josh is speaking about. It's something that is complex and will take a little bit of a ramp. So don't necessarily get discouraged. Anything else for this individual's question or next question? All right, we'll go into the next. Cool. All right. So people want to meet you, apparently. I've gotten a couple DMs, and then there's one in the chat about someone asking if you're going to Helm Summit. When's the next conference that folks can meet you face-to-face, or what are some of the conferences that you have on your agendas for the next, until the end of the year? KubeCon San Diego, anyone?
Next week, I'll be at Velocity San Jose, which intersects a little bit with the Kubernetes community, but I probably won't be at any of the big events until KubeCon San Diego.
Yeah, party on the beach. David, are you going to San Diego?
I don't think so. I've never actually been to a KubeCon, but
What?
mostly because I haven't been able to get any talks accepted. So I'll have to try harder.
Program committee, get some
Yeah.
node talks.
No, it's okay. I need to do things that are interesting and exciting and then talk about them.
We can do a talk. I'll do a talk with you. Come on, let's do one. I don't know what we can talk on, but we can figure it out. Like, Josh, I'm sure you can figure out something to talk about with David too. Josh, where are you going to be? What any upcoming conferences people can
I'm not going. I'm going there. KubeCon Shanghai. So we're having the Chinese Kubernetes conference, which will include a contributor summit for both current and new contributors, which I'm running actually. And
surprise.
Yeah, and that's in less than 3 weeks now, actually, 2.5 weeks.
Yeah, that's pretty yeah. I can't believe that it's already here. Hello, Shanghai. Yeah, so if anybody is going to KubeCon Shanghai, that's a good announcement and plug is, yes, there will be a new contributor workshop there. But if you're also a current contributor, they're hanging out and having some fun and doing some networking there too. So go and meet some folks if you're in Shanghai. All right, somebody in the chat wants us to do a Kubernetes wrap. Unfortunately, I do not have Kelsey's skills. I got David's face. So, yeah, no, on the recording, we're gonna have to snip out David's face right there. That was hilarious. He was really scared for a second. Like I'm not rhyming anything. Someone wants to know, are the contributor workshops prior to the summits recorded? Yes, they are indeed. You can look those up. There is a link actually that Castro Joe put in there right above. Feel free to click that link. We have, I think, 2 or 3 sets of new contributor workshops recorded now. We should probably take like the first one down just out of stale information, but always check out the last. That would be in KubeCon Barcelona. And then, all right, I have a couple of current contributor questions in my DMs right now, but I'm looking in the chat to make sure we're covered. Looks like we're good for chat questions. All right, first current contributor, which is a popular question as of late, which is tell me how you give yourself or provide yourself self-care. How do you avoid burnout? Valerie spoke earlier about how she's involved in all the things. How are you staying sane?
No comment.
AKA Valerie is currently not sane right now. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm trying to shed load and optimize what I'm working on right now.
And that's important to know and to recognize. Saying no is fine, and so is saying, hey, I just don't have the time to work on this. So it's totally respectable. Take care of yourself. David, what about you?
Yeah, I think it's mostly about managing the number of things that you're working on at once. For example, I spent a bunch of time in the winter of 2018 working on trying to figure out how we could get tracing to do something sensible with Kubernetes objects. And I worked and had a KEP that was open. It might still be open actually, but worked and made some progress and solved some problems that we hadn't been able to solve before. And it still didn't quite meet the bar. And so I've had to just set it aside and work on other things, just because it's okay not to succeed at getting a feature in, or sometimes it's just not the right time in the community. So working on just a couple things at once and making sure that you're able to focus on it is really important.
It's really the statement you said about it's not the right time for the community is also a really mature statement. So I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Josh, what about you? Travel bee. I think you're still muted, but I don't see the mute button. I don't hear you. No.
I don't have anything to add.
Oh, yeah, there you are. Yeah, whatever wires you're crossing in the back there. Yeah. I just see I feel like I see a hand behind a monitor right now, like jiggling stuff. All right, I can hear you. You there?
Yeah.
Okay. Tell us about your self-care routines.
Oh. I think I'm a bad one to talk about that right now, given that I just came off of 6 weeks of straight travel. Don't do that. I really don't recommend it.
Well, no, that's a good tip. Talk about that.
Oh, I go to conferences as part of my job, running Red Hat booths at conferences, running contributor summits, doing a bunch of other things. And so this year, a bunch of stuff just stacked up right next to each other. So Seattle DevOps Days, DockerCon, Red Hat Summit, KubeCon Barcelona, Percona Live, another smaller event in the middle somewhere, which is just a really bad idea. Because if nothing else, the constantly shifting time zones really gets to you. So if you have any choice about your own travel schedule at all, I really recommend having at least a week at home in between events.
Yes, that is definitely self-care as well. Time in between events is wonderful. All right. Thank you all. And then there was also, if you're listening, there was a burnout panel that was recorded, I think. I have not seen the recording, but there was a recent burnout panel at KubeCon Barcelona. If you want to search for that on YouTube, it was very, very good. I know tons of people who went and some of the panelists who had a good time doing it. So you should definitely check that out as well. All right, next current contributor question. Speaking of KEPs, KEP question. How can any tricks, tips, or your experience on how to move a KEP quickly through consensus?
I think in my experience, one of the biggest things is to be very clear about the scope and intended changes, which includes strong communication skills as to what you're proposing, as well as being very judicious about what you put in the non-goals section. So when we write a KEP, we have a specific set of goals for it. We also list a section called non-goals, which is basically meant to be anything that is potentially a logical conclusion or related that we don't want to touch. So that's a good way to get people to focus on exactly what you proposed versus have a gigantic bike shedding argument, as well as focusing on each specific KEP phase. So for example, provisional is just meant to be, we agree that we would like to do this. We think the thing that's outlined is not unreasonable. So let's push it further versus having a production ready plan at that phase.
We just had another question that's sort of similar. So in the same breath, let's talk about somebody wants to know how you get it in front of the right people too. So how do we, with tips on getting it through a consensus period, and then tips on getting it in front of the right people?
What I've seen a lot of is people circulating feedback within Slack meetings and mailing lists before even going to a KEP. For example, we had a pretty big one in SIG network come up around partitioning up endpoint results, just due to like the scalability of having a single endpoint object with thousands of IPs. And that had like a fair bit of discussion within the SIG before it even went to a CAP, because we wanted to kind of talk about it and figure it out and decide, like, do we want to look more at this route instead of someone kind of jumping in and dropping a book on our desks and walking away. It kind of speaks to both like the trust aspect of the community.
They can totally be books too.
Yeah, they can. So that deals with like both the trust aspect of the community and kind of the fact that sometimes it's not the right time or the right solution. So we don't want to get too involved in a CAP before figuring that out.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I would add as well that, I forgot what I was going to say. Going and thinking about it in a couple different phases can be useful. So at first, you're really trying to spread the word about the need. And so you'll go to SIGs and you'll say, hey, like this is a problem I really think we should solve. And I really think it should be on your roadmap for 117, right? And before you necessarily step in with, here's my prescribed solution and this is what I want to do. So coming forward with the problem first and doing your homework and coming in with like production examples are really powerful, I think, in SIGs, because contributors don't necessarily always have a production Kubernetes cluster up and running that they can, when you come to them with a problem, they can go, oh yeah, I hit that all the time, right? Because we don't always run a lot of Kubernetes, we just work on it. So coming in, doing your homework and having all the evidence that this is a big problem area and that the SIG should address it, I think can be really helpful in getting ideas from people who are really experienced in the SIG, as well as sort of getting acknowledgement that your problem is worth solving and worth putting on the SIG's roadmap.
It was super good advice. Josh, any tips, tricks? You see these caps all the time coming through with release stuff.
I don't know. I'm not sure the caps are the place to start just because they're pretty big. I mean, maybe it's different for SIG network. That was Val's suggestion, was starting with a cap.
Well, it was kind of starting with precursors to the cap.
The precursors?
Mm-hmm.
You want to explain?
Dealing with like first off opening an issue and like circulating the discussion before getting to the cap. Like the cap is kind of the big phase, but I do think that like dropping a cap in is the way to start. Probably isn't the way to go.
All right. And then David, I actually dropped a question for you in Zoom chat that might need some homework for you to answer beforehand, so check that out. And then we'll go into the next question. Next question for from a current contributor. It's talking about building trust. They're saying that they are doing a lot of smaller tasks, smaller PRs, cleanup work, things along those lines. Like, at what point in time do they have the conversation, or does somebody else have the conversation as to like how they get into an owner's file? Like, when does that conversation start? Who initiates it? I guess they're just a little confused as to like how they're actually getting to that stage.
I may have a different opinion than other people, and that's fine. I actually just put myself in an owner's file last week for the first time. And I've been here for 2.5 years. I don't know if it necessarily makes sense as a community for us to think about being in an owner's file as being sort of a personal objective. It's like, sure, it gives you the ability to merge stuff. When I added myself, it was mostly because I felt that one, the current approvers in the directories that I had would look to me anyways to approve the change. And two, that I think the objective is more around reducing the burden for higher level approvers than for giving anyone in particular any extra privileges. So I don't know if the focus on owners' files is necessarily very useful, but I would say that, for example, if you end up writing a lot of code and you're the person who knows the most about it, that's sort of a reasonable place for you to be an owner.
That's a good
And if you just feel like you don't get enough email from GitHub, by all means add yourself to an owner's file. Guarantee that your mailbox will never be empty. I will also say that owner's files are not necessarily even limited to code. Most of the owner files that I'm in are for things like a new contributor workshop, etc. We just use it throughout all of the stuff on GitHub, and almost all of our stuff is on GitHub.
So it sounds like TLDR for experience there is, if you're writing the code, if you know a lot of the code, or docs or community management, anything that's in our repos, if you think you know this solidly and people come to you for advice on it, you might want to PR yourself into the owner's file and have that conversation with the rest of the owner's files folks.
Yeah.
TLDR. All right. Valerie, do you have any other takes? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, David. No, I apologize.
Especially if you're like one of the few people who knows the most about it, I would say. Like,
yep.
Yeah.
Valerie, do you have a different take or an additional take or anything like that?
Not really. I'm not in any owner's files.
Okay. Yet, by the way, yet. Anyway. David, did you get a chance to check out that question about the image GC and where it's doing its checkings?
Yeah, sure. I can talk a bit about image garbage collection. Let me share my screen real quick.
Yeah. And for those who are just listening to us, there was a question in chat. They have a cap about image GC. There is a link in chat if you're following along with Meet Our Contributors. And they wanted to know some things about the cap. So David's going to share a screen and talk
about the cap.
Yeah, or not necessarily the cap itself, but the question that the individual had at hand. Go ahead.
I can explain garbage collection a little bit. Yeah. So the code that does garbage collection is in the image GC manager, which is package kubelet images, image GC manager. And the way that it's currently structured is it has two functions that tend to get called frequently. One is garbage collect and one is delete unused images. Garbage collect is based on the image GC policy that you specify with kubelet flags. So you set what you think the high percentage should be, and then when it hits the high percentage, what the low percentage it should garbage collect down to is, and then how long. Oh, that's new. I haven't seen that before, but looks like there's also a how long an image can has to exist before it can be removed. And the image garbage collector interfaces with the stats collection system. So it will end up, let's see if I can find it. It will end up periodically checking the stats on the disk that holds the images. And then if it needs to garbage collect, it'll end up, let's see, calling this function here, which then should talk to the container runtime and ask it to remove a certain number of images. Interestingly, this code path is triggered by two different mechanisms. One is the one I just talked about, which is, if I can find it again, oh, there it is, which is setting the high and low thresholds for image garbage collection. And the other path is actually eviction. So if you run your node out of disk say because a pod created an empty dir and used it all, then before it goes and evicts your workload, it'll actually go and try and reclaim images that aren't being used. So those are the two code paths that end up triggering the garbage collection of images, and it all ends up happening in package kubelet images, image GC manager.
Awesome. I love impromptu deep dives. Yeah. Sorry, y'all.
Cool.
That might get trimmed out for the YouTubers who want to know about garbage collection. Thank you so much, Peter. That was awesome. That's sort of a good segue into next question, which this current contributor wants to know: are there any areas of the project that you work on that you see contributors making either the same mistake, or like you wish you could tell contributors en masse this one thing? Like, what's that one thing and why? It could be technical or non-technical, meaning code or not, or docs or not code or not docs. Like if you had a megaphone and you could say, "Stop doing this," or "Hey, don't forget to read this doc." Anything like that come to mind? Josh, I'm sure you have something, especially for release.
For docs to read before you get started?
Yeah, or no, just in general, like anything that you see contributors making the same mistake about that you wish like they would read read like this doc or whatever. Just a common trend in either contributor errors or mistakes or things that like stumbling roadblocks, stuff like that.
I don't know. It's specific to different groups. I mean, like one sort of, ongoing problem that we see with people who are contributing as part of a corporate team is that they will all of a sudden show up with a big chunk of code and say, "Hey, here's this thing that we would like to have in Kubernetes," with no sort of preface to it. And that code is almost never acceptable under those circumstances. Because it'll turn out to clash with other things. We'll have the wrong style, it'll be in the wrong place. It'll be something that we decided a while ago to move out to an API and therefore doesn't belong in Kubernetes core code at all. And the answer for that is just that if your team where you work wants to contribute something to Kubernetes or whatever, get involved with the appropriate SIG or SIGs early. Talk about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and people will give you tips in how to properly integrate that into Kubernetes, rather than trying to just do a code dump, which, I mean, it's not just Kubernetes. I've worked on other open source projects, and large code dumps pretty much always end up being a lot more work than if you started working with the existing project contributors to begin with.
Super good tip. Communication is key. Val or David?
Maybe I'll just rehash a point that I kind of alluded to earlier, which is that as like a volunteer contributor, I get a lot of prospective people who like are going to also volunteer their time reaching out to me. And I think like the biggest factor of success I see is how much legwork people are willing to do. Like some people are just jumping in on issues and asking questions, and other people like really want to be guided. They haven't read the developer guide. They aren't going to look at the code. They just want to be like pointed and kind of like have their hand guided. And I don't think that for a lot of SIGs, that's something that's going to be successful. I think kind of going out there and participating and finding work and making sure that you are up to date is going to be the best way. So that can mean like looking at the code base, relevant things, going through the contributor guides, going to meetings.
David, anything that tips wise that you want to share with the last 2 minutes?
Not too much came to mind. I think that the one thing that I did think of is that, especially for like SIG leads, email is probably not a very useful tool. Just if you're trying to get in touch with someone because you need a review or approval or something, I think usually Slack tends to be the best way to put a message in someone's ear that they'll hear in a week. Or
I appreciate that SLA you just slipped in there. Yeah.
Or working on issues that may eventually, like if you open an issue, maybe someone else can resolve it before it needs to involve like the lead of a SIG, for example. Yeah, I think that's the biggest surprise people have, is even though it's an open community, the people who have a lot of responsibility tend to be way overloaded.
Yes, and such is open source. Last question. Do you have any questions for each other? Now that you've been doing this thing for an hour, I don't know if you knew each other beforehand. Any questions? Because this is the last question. It's a meta one. All right. That wraps our show for June. If anybody that's watching would like to reach out to any of us, we are on Slack, as David mentioned. I think you can I'm sure you can find us from our handles that we have here on Zoom. I'm Paris. There is 2 Parises actually now in the Kubernetes Slack instance. Pretty crazy. 66,000 people. I guess there's going to be 2 Parises. So yeah, find us, meet our contributors Slack channel. Next month we'll be here. Same time, same place. Thank you so much, panelists. You've helped many today. Appreciate all of your help and support. That wraps us up. Thank you. See y'all later.